I started making art seriously about 3.5 years ago. But before that, I was spending a lot of time in art school, and I was doing a lot of experimentation. I used to be very much interested in a lot of objects and materials. I used to produce, I had most of my training in painting, so I used to do a lot of traditional painting, and then also I used to make sculptures.
Where did you study?
In Ghana, at the University of Science and Technology in a city called Kumasi. So I was mostly working with traditional mediums, paint, plaster. So I used to make figures, but I used to work with plaster. And what I would do was that I would pour the plaster on a surface, mostly on the skin of models, and when it hardened, I would take it off and then I would use that as the art form. So it was mostly very figurative. And then at a point, I was traveling from Ghana to one of the neighboring countries, and I was stuck at the border for a really long time. It was really important, and I saw all these trucks that were carrying food mostly across the border, and it was very easy. But at that moment, something dawned on me about what this material represented in terms, the jute sack and what it represented. It was more or less like a vessel that could take the shape of anything and move into one space or the other. So I thought it was very interesting. One, from a poetic sense, and then secondly also looking at the aesthetics of it and then the politics associated with the material. So when I came back to Ghana, I started using this material as one of the objects I was using on the body. But later on, I realized that at a higher level, when the material is used over and over again, and then later on it is used to transport charcoal, the material seems to have collapsed at that point, because once you put charcoal into it and it stains the material, you can no longer put food into it. So it became really interesting for me. So that's when I actually realized that the tension between an object and also what it contains is something that is really important to me. So I began using this idea of crisis as a medium of production. So what I actually do in my process as an artist is that I mostly buy new materials. So all these materials that you see, the tendency is that because sometimes you're African and you use materials that seem to have a certain sense of poverty about it, people think it's found material, but it's not found. Because you have to negotiate for them. You have to buy new materials, and then you have to give it to those who own these old materials that have collapsed, and then take the old ones. So every object that you see in my work represents a certain form of exchange. So this exchange became really important. Yeah, this exchange became really important in terms of looking at how you can create a dialogue between different spaces. And the crisis of architecture also, like in a postmodern system, was something that I was also very much interested in. In as much as I was interested in making art, I was also interested in the experience of it. How do the audience, which I tend to think are people in the city and other spaces, are somehow inscribed in the language of the material? Because when we trade in things, or when one thing moves from one place to the other, we are normally interested in the commodity, but we are not really interested in the actual process of how the system of production actually works. And I thought that could be interesting, actually, when you look at it from another perspective. And that was this, like looking at the sites of production and all that. So the way I produce my work is that I go to different spaces, which most of the time are in crisis. So like train stations, buildings under construction, like just public spaces and all that, and we create this work within these spaces, and I work with a lot of people, so mostly between 20 to 200 people. It depends on which specific site, because the work takes a lot of time, and sometimes as you work and you move from one space to the other, the dynamics of the work changes, because the labor force is very crude, and most of the people that I work with to produce these things are in such a precarious situation that it influences the way the aesthetic of the work is made and how the work is also sewn together geometrically. So I'm very much also concerned about the nuances of the work in terms of the little details, and when you install it within a space, how it reactivates the space in a different sense. So here in the light first of all, when I was invited for this show, it wasn't so easy to say yes right away, because I also had to think about a lot of other things. But when I came and I saw the space, I think it was really exciting, especially looking at the contradiction between the space and then also looking at the crude nature of the work and also the politics embedded within it. So I thought it would be interesting also just pragmatically to challenge myself as an artist in terms of looking at how the work would function in a space like this, and also offer another sense of dialogue in terms of installing the work in Israel and then looking at it against the politics. Most of the times when I make work, I'm not very direct in the discourse that I approach. I like to engage with it within a certain poetic sense. So just by using objects, everyday objects, and then rearranging them with a specific kind of labor, and then also with a specific within a very, very specific site, I think that it raises certain questions, maybe questions of aesthetics or experience, or just everyday politics and experience. I think that it's a very simple idea, but I just try to do it the most simple way that I can, so at least everyone can have a certain sense of experience to it, especially when you're producing from Ghana, because being in art school, one of the problems was that coming out of art school, we don't really have a lot of institutions. So most artists will work in school because after school they want to show it all the institutions. But for me, I was thinking about how I could make a work that actually didn't need an institution, that I could keep on practicing independently and then be able to use spaces around. So most of the early work that I did was actually going into spaces within the cities and in rural areas, spaces that were overlooked, and then trying to re-examine these spaces and the histories of it, and then also using objects to kind of create this visual language. And somehow, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It's not so much about succeeding, it's more or less about experimenting and then asking questions over and over again.